Now we come to sexual immorality, so-called, and how this ties up. I insist, as I said at the beginning of this talk, that nobody should ever blame himself for anything. He should, by all means, forthrightly say, yes, I did wrong, if he did, and then try calmly to go about changing. Now, in the sexual area, we have at least two major problems, because, first of all, what is wrong? Most of us will accept that stealing and murder and outright lying are not the best acts in the world, because if you do these things, you help create the kind of a society which you would not want to live in. And the interest of your own self-interest is rather silly and self-defeating in the last analysis to do these kind of behaviors. But what about sex activities? Which of these are wrong? Are sexual deviations, such as homosexuality, really immoral, or premarital sex relations, or adultery? Well, in first determining this, I think we have to have another vector added to the usual concept of immorality, because unfortunately, for historical reasons, which are largely theological, I'd say, the concept of immorality has been, for many centuries now, anti-sociality. In other words, anybody who does anything which the group doesn't like, or which seems to be inimical to the group, is considered immoral. The prototype of this is the Judeo-Christian philosophy of the early Jews, who were a small tribe in Israel and had to protect themselves, and went largely for procreation in order to get more soldiers to fight off the enemies, in order to keep procreating themselves against the inroads of disease, warlike tribes around them, and so on. And their morality was based on the notion, largely, that we bow down to our own social group, our family group in particular, but also the social group, and to God, presumably, who supports our great tribal group here. And that in so doing, in bowing down, this is what we mean by morality. Now, I say that this is not a completely invalid concept, because we all live in social groups, and immorality in one sense of the word means not doing needless, direct, gratuitous harm to other human beings, because I said before, this would finally evolve in our own harming ourselves and creating the kind of a society in which we would not want to live. But it has another vector which has got lost in the shuffle, it seems to me. That is, added to anti-sociality, we should really have anti-selfhood. In other words, I posit the proposition that it's just as immoral to defeat one's own ends, to be against oneself, as it is to be against the group. And it's quite possible to be pro-group and anti-self. In fact, in our Judeo-Christian culture, I think that's exactly what we treat, what we make the average person to be. To some degree, pro-group, presumably a conformist who goes along with the group, and very definitely sacrificial, Florence Nightingale-ish, as I said before, against himself or herself. And any realistic concept of morality, it seems to me, of wrongdoing, quite aside from punishments and blame and so on, will have to take into account the self. And I say that there are really about four major vectors to immorality, all of which can be derived from the basic truth that morality consists of being A, for the self, and B, not against the group, not needlessly, directly, gratuitously harming others. The first of these vectors we could call the pro-self, pro-social vector. In other words, an individual can be for himself and also for the group. And this, I would say, is a nice ideal of morality, rather than just, as we've said for many years, for the group. Now let's illustrate this by certain sexual practices. Let's take the act, for example, of masturbation. In my estimation, though not in that of a lot of other my fellow psychologists, sociologists, psychiatrists, and so on. I would certainly say that masturbation under usual circumstances is pro-self. We call it autoeroticism, meaning self-stimulation. And presumably people do this because they enjoy it. In fact, they learn to enjoy it in most instances quite on their own without any teaching or reading of books and so on, though in many instances they also learn from other sources. This is clearly a pro-self function, as far as I can see, a behavior pattern. And I would also say it's pro-social, at least in the sense of not doing anybody else in, because it's a little difficult to do anybody else in when you are masturbating. If it can be done, I haven't seen it done yet. Now, under unusual circumstances, masturbation can be anti-self. If, for example, you become a fetishist and fearful of heterosexual relations and masturbate only because you're fearful of these broader relationships and therefore restrict your activity to masturbation even when heterosexual relations are available, then in my estimation, psychologically, you are narrowing your field of activity needlessly and becoming really anti-self, self-defeating. But most of the time, in 95% of the cases, or probably 99% of the cases, this is not true. People masturbate because they like it, they enjoy it, and because other activities are not, for the moment, unfortunately, available. Most males and females do not masturbate particularly when and if they're not afraid of heterosexual relations and they are able to get these relations. Another activity is petting. Petting, it seems to me, is distinctly pro-self because, again, it seems to my prejudiced eye that people enjoy this, do it out of liking, though they can do it because they want to be loved or conform to their particular group or something like that, which I would not consider necessarily pro-self. And they certainly seem to doubly enjoy it. I've never seen a human being really who was harmed by having a mutual orgasm in petting. You not only please yourself, you please the partner. Same thing goes for premarital or marital coitus. These are acts which we enjoy normally when we participate in them. And if we are nice and polite and accord the other individual an orgasm thereby, the other individual enjoys them. So under most circumstances, again, 95 to 98%, these are pro-self and pro-social, and I definitely would not consider them immoral. The only immoral aspects would be when you coerce the other individual at the point of a gun into engaging in these, which we'll go into in a moment, or when you're defeating your own end, as I said, by neurotically sticking even to something like intercourse and not engaging in any other kind of sex activity, such as oral relations or something like that, because you think it's wicked, horrible, awful, and some Judeo-Christian god of 2,000 years ago presumably said so to Moses on Mount Sinai. This I would consider self-defeating. Now let's take an act which may be pro-self but anti-social. And here we have sex acts. Presumably we're largely talking tonight about sex. I'll keep my illustrations in the sexual area so you can see they apply to other areas. Sadistic acts or rape, where the individual obviously is going for his own satisfaction to a large degree in being sadistic or raping another person, normally a male raping a female, but we've had a few illustrations of the opposite. But obviously, being sadistic, unless the other individual is a masochist, or raping an individual against this person's will at the point of a gun or with force, is anti-social. And I would definitely say that this act, even though pro-self, is hardly desirable because, as I said before, you would hardly want the kind of a society where you yourself were forced to have sex relations or be the object of a sadist at the point of a gun or some other threat or duress. Then we have acts which are anti-self, but pro-social. Here we have, for example, masochism. where the individual does himself in takes pain, sexual pain, usually because he's quite disturbed and thinks that if he accepts sex in the raw, as I've said in my book, The Folklore of Sex, and other of my writings, he will then have to be very guilty and expiate his sin, so he takes it with pain, and he gets a certain degree of pleasure out of it, but in the last analysis, he's being anti-self. He's restricting his own sex activity, and yet he's, in a sense, being pro-social because the other individual with whom he has masochistic relations may get considerable satisfaction out of these. Sometimes adultery is in this same category, not always, where the individual may be pro-social because the other person in the adulterous relationship may be having a great time of it, particularly if the other person, let us say, is unmarried. But if the individual who's engaging in adultery is married himself and is jeopardizing a better relationship which he might have with his spouse in order to engage in a sort of fly-by-night adulterous affair, and this happens often, then he may be anti-self while being pro-social. Under other circumstances where he isn't getting along in the least with his wife and hasn't had sex relations with her for years and they don't particularly mind either of them the adultery, then it could be a pro-self as well as a pro-social activity. And finally, there's the major category of acts which are anti-self and anti-social. For example, sadomasochism, where the individual, at one and the same time, can be against himself masochistically and also against his partner. He may be both sadistic and masochistic. Or let us take homosexuality. In our culture particularly, where homosexuality is banned, and although I don't think it should be banned legally, it is, and where practically all exclusive or fixed homosexuals are seriously disturbed individuals, as I've said in many of my writings, the normal fixed homosexual, if you want to use such a term, is against himself because he's given up, as I often say, half the population of the world as sex partners, and the most delightful half, I'm prejudiced enough to say, and is restricting himself arbitrarily to the other half, and very often in many other ways. And he's doing himself in. Therefore, he is usually, though not necessarily always, anti-self, because he may also get some satisfaction from this. And very often he's antisocial in that he may be going about seducing others, particularly young males, who will then become just as disturbed frequently as he, and he's contributing, especially legally, to their delinquency, and is doing an act of needlessly harming the other human being. So this act may be both anti-self and antisocial. Now, I'm sure there are other vectors we could add. We could differentiate, for example, between anti-social in the sense of people in general and anti-social in the sense of your one or more sex partners and so on. But we haven't got time to go into all the nuances at present. And I think these four major segments will cover most of the activity. And if they do, then I would say that the pro-self and pro-social acts, as I said before, such as petting, masturbation, premarital, and marital coitus, are certainly to be called moral, and that the pro-self antisocial acts are very dubiously moral, because they're antisocial. That the anti-self and pro-social acts are also, in my estimation, relatively immoral, and the anti-self and antisocial acts are distinctly immoral. So from my standpoint, wrongdoing would be doing an act, a sex act in this case, which is one of the last three and would not be doing an act which is pro-self and pro-social. Now let's suppose, however, that an individual in this definition does do wrong. Let's suppose he engages in fixed homosexuality, or even he's very sadistic or sadomasochistic and does himself in and others. The question is, should he still feel guilty? Should he think he's allowed for so doing? And I say no, absolutely not. Because just as he may do any other mistake, he may make a mistake at work or in other criminal ventures such as stealing, the only sane and sensible thing for him to do is say, A, I made a mistake. B, how do I not make this mistake in the future? In this instance, A, I've now been participating in sadomasochistic relations for the last several years. How do I get over this hogwash and participate in other kinds of sex relations which would give me a much broader range of satisfaction? And if he tackles this thing objectively without the self-blame of what a louse and a no-goodnik I am, then I say he has a most excellent chance, not immediately, but certainly eventually, of solving the problem. Because any human being who can do a thing, such as be sadomasochistic, cannot do the same thing unless he is blaming himself immensely and saying, oh my God, how terrible it is that I did this thing. Then he gets distracted into how terrible I am, how awful, how catastrophic it is. And under those circumstances, he does not normally, very rarely, change. So even when an individual does a sex act, which virtually all of us, from the arch conservatives and the Catholics to the irreligionists such as myself, would consider to be antisocial and anti-self, then he still should never feel guilty, feel upset, feel blamed, or anything like that. He should say, yes, I did this. What am I going to do next time? He should objectively say and admit his mistake and look for a solution, which it would be almost impossible not to find if this is what he were doing. Now, in order to help individuals do this sort of thing, I've devised a technique which I call rational psychotherapy, which analyzes for them their sentences. And I insist in the theory of rational therapy that people always tell themselves sentences, adults at least, when they get guilty, upset, anxious, depressed, and so on, and that if we can find these sentences and parse them into their logical and illogical parts, and throw out the illogic in them and keep the logic, then human beings can change. In the basic illustration I'm giving you, if we can take the sentence, I did wrongly because my act is antisocial, self-defeating, and anti-self, and keep that part of the sentence, and then look at the second part, therefore I am no good, I am a louse, I am a blackguard, and start questioning and challenging that second part and say, why am I a blackguard? Why am I no good? Who said so? Moses? Jesus? Confucius? Well, what the hell did they know about the subject? And did my parents tell me this? Those poor sick people? And my society, with its antics, and so on? If we can get the individual to say, why am I repeating, suggesting to myself this palpably self-defeating sentence, which will obviously lead to the same kind of sick behaviors I'm now doing, meaning the guilt, the feeling of grief, self-anger, depression, and so on, then we can get the individual to change. But if he goes on not looking at the sentences, leaving them in what the Freudians call his unconscious, but what I would rather refer to his unawareness, because he just doesn't look at these sentences and talks himself into believing that he has feelings without the sentences, which he doesn't really have, then he never really tries to solve the problem, and it becomes pretty obvious that he's getting nowhere. Then he starts blaming himself more for getting nowhere, for being a hopeless neurotic, and he ends up not only in the psychotherapist's office, but very frequently not in the psychotherapist's office, and goes round and round and round in a vicious circle. So in the technique of rational psychotherapy, we try to show the person exactly what he is telling himself in simple, declarative, or exclamatory sentences, which are always there, how to parse, analyze, challenge, defeat these self-defeating sentences, and therefore to change. In order to show you more specifically exactly what is done in some instances, I'm now going to quote a few pages from my favorite author, myself. In my latest book, The Art and Science of Love, which just came out a few days, and you may have seen advertised in the New York Times yesterday, and give you a little more detailed impression of how a sex case, a case that involves shame and guilt, would be handled. Now, let me just briefly say, before I go into that the old time kind of guilt, which Freud talked about, is not with us too much any longer. That Freud very correctly said in his day that a lot of human beings, whenever they did a wrong act, such as a sex act, especially masturbation or homosexuality or something like that, immediately started sort of saying to themselves, so he didn't use that language, oh, this is terrible, this is awful, God won't love me, this is evil, this is wicked, and so on. All of which goes back really to God or some other power won't love me, and I am worthless, no good. Now today we don't have much of this guilt, because fortunately fewer and fewer of us believe in these kinds of anthropomorphic gods who are going to punish us. But we have an even greater amount, I'd say, of shame, which is what Alfred Adler started to see way back in 1908 or so and broke away from the Freudian. Shame means that instead of saying, oh, what a louse I am, God's going to punish me, how wicked, how evil I am, you change that into how incompetent, how inadequate, how inferior I am. I cannot love me because I just did this horrible deed, meaning make a mistake. And my culture says that anybody who makes a mistake and does not become President of the United States is no damn good, and therefore I am no good. So we really have more shame today, feelings of incompetency, rather than feelings of guilt. Some of us still have the feeling of guilt, that God will strike me dead. Certainly we have fundamentalists, Baptists, and others. But especially in areas like New York and among college graduates, we have a lot more shame than guilt. And it's this sort of thing which must be tackled, and which I try to tackle in rational therapy. With this prelude, I shall read these few pages, and you'll see more specifically what we try to do in rational therapy about the problem of guilt, particularly about shame as applied to sexual disturbances. So I say in the book, rational therapy differs from most other forms of therapy in that A, not merely the facts and the psychodynamics of the patient's behavior are revealed, but more to the point, his underlying philosophies or ideas which lead to and flow from these historical facts. B, a concerted attack is made on the irrational beliefs that are disclosed in the course of the therapeutic process. C, emphasis is placed far less on the disclosure of the individual's unconscious drives or feelings than on revealing his unconscious and irrational attitudes which underlie these drives or feelings. D, the therapist literally teaches the patient how to observe his unconscious, illogical thinking, and how instead to change his internalized sentences and to think straight. And E, the patient is usually encouraged, urged, or helped to take emotionally re-educating activity, or to do what I call his homework. In the treatment of individuals suffering from psychosexual impotence or frigidity, I find that the use of rational psychotherapy is particularly helpful. I learned many years ago that merely showing an individual that his or her sexual inadequacy stems from childhood complexes, such as the male's guilt over his incestuous attachment to his mother, or a female's penis envy, rarely, if ever, gets him or her over this inadequacy, even when such interpretations are true. The reason for this is that in our present-day society, as distinct from the Vienna of Freud's day, people tend to have sex problems largely as a result of the secondary reaction of shame rather than the primary reaction of guilt. And getting them over their guilt, which is not even necessarily accomplished by interpreting to them its early origins, does not rid them of their shame. Take, for example, the case of a 25-year-old male whom I saw several months ago because he kept losing his erection as soon as he started to have intercourse with his wife. It was quickly apparent in his case that he did have a somewhat classical Oedipus complex, which I do not often see among my patients today, but which from time to time does turn up, and that he had always been guilty about having sex relations with any female partner, because his mother, who was still young and attractive, had literally taught him that sex was largely for procreative purposes and that, quote, more worthwhile, unquote, people enjoyed themselves with higher and better pursuits. Consequently, he had only had 2 or 3 abortive attempts at intercourse before marriage, and had married a rather unattractive physician, a few years older than himself, who was a highly intellectual and, according to his and his mother's standards, more worthwhile sort of person. He had been potent with his wife until she became pregnant with their first and so far only child. And since that time, although the child was now 2 years of age, he had never been completely potent again. It was easy to see why this patient was afraid to be potent, or to risk a pun, was scared unstiff. And it was not difficult to get him to accept the interpretation that his impotency originally stemmed from his unconscious, incestuous feelings for his mother, and his conscious belief that sex for the sake of fun was improper. Unfortunately, however, his acceptance of these interpretations had no particular effect on his potency. The patient was then shown that while his primary disturbance may well have been connected with his relations with his mother and his anti-sexual beliefs thus engendered, his secondary and for the moment more important disturbance was connected with his feelings of shame, of incompetency, of failure. That is to say, his society, and in his particular case, his father more than his mother, had raised him wholeheartedly to believe that the worst possible thing in the world, and in many ways even worse than enjoying himself sexually, was a weakling, a nincompoop, a failure. Consequently, when he first started to become impotent, instead of asking himself the simple question, why am I failing sexually, and what can I do not to keep failing, he kept telling himself over and over, see what a failure I am. This proves what I've always suspected, that I'm weak, no good. Oh my God, how awful it is for me to be this incompetent and unmanly. By repeating these kind of catastrophizing sentences, of course, he kept focusing and refocusing on sexual failure rather than success. And he could not possibly overcome his impotence. It must be remembered in this connection that both male and female sexual arousability and incitation to orgasm are mainly mediated from impulses from the cerebral cortex, which are basically cognitive or thinking in origin. We become sexually excited and have orgasms not just because our sex organs are physically stimulated, but because we think about, imagine, focus upon arousing and orgasm-creating ideas. When, however, we focus upon non-sexual notions, such as the idea that it is awful or catastrophic when we are not coming to climax, it is literally impossible for us to focus simultaneously on sexual ideas. The result in the male is inability to obtain or maintain erection, or inability to achieve orgasm, even though erection is adequate. I've not found a single case recently of male impotence where, no matter what the original cause of the inadequacy, the afflicted individual was not secondarily blaming himself for his inadequacy, telling himself how horrible it was to be impotent, convincing himself that he was a terrible failure and that as such he would continue to be impotent. So with this patient, he kept, once his first symptoms arose, ceaselessly watching himself, expecting himself to be impotent, worrying about his weakness, and continually giving himself a difficult, though unfortunately not a hard, time. Once I showed him exactly what he was doing and what nonsensical, catastrophizing sentences he was telling himself to sustain his impotence, and once I got him to start contradicting this nonsense he kept telling himself, he quickly began to improve. Thus, I got him to see that it was not terrible, but only expectable for him to be impotent, considering his upbringing. I got him to admit to himself that he was not an incompetence or a failure just because he had sex problems. I got him generally to question his entire concept of masculinity and failure, and to see that doing, trying, and working at things are more important than necessarily succeeding at or doing them perfectly. Once he began to give up his philosophy of absolute success and perfectionism, he was able to watch his sexual behavior more objectively and then to focus on sexually exciting stimuli. At the same time, though this seemed less necessary with this patient since he had already by himself worked through some of his originally mother-inculcated Puritanism, I also tackled his basic beliefs that sex was wicked outside of procreation and that incestuous desires toward one's own mother were horrible to contemplate. On two levels, then, by attacking A, his original anti-sexual philosophy that first led him to become impotent, and B, his secondary philosophy of success and perfectionism that led him to retain, sustain, and aggravate his original symptoms of impotence, I directed this patient to more rational modes of thinking about himself and his sexuality. Whereas, when I used to do psychoanalysis, I mainly would have concentrated on the first of these points, I now, with the use of rational therapy, mainly concentrate on the second point. And I found that this kind of focusing to be much more effective. Almost invariably, with very few exceptions, I find this to be true in psychosexual impotence and frigidity. I shall briefly cite a case of frigidity in the female, which also was resolved by application of rational therapeutic approach. The patient was a 34-year-old wife and mother who had never had an orgasm with her husband or in any of the several extramarital affairs she had recently carried on, largely because she wanted to try to overcome her frigidity. It was easy to ascertain that she considered her own mother to be a whore, since she had frequently caught her with lovers when the patient was a child, and was determined not to enjoy sex in the same kind of manner in which her mother obviously had enjoyed it. But giving the patient insight into this origin of her frigidity served not a bit to enable her to overcome it. What proved to be much more effective was showing the patient that she not only hated her mother, but more importantly, hated herself, because A, she came from such a supposedly bad family, B, thought that she was wicked for being hostile to her mother, C, had always refused to buckle down to difficult responsibilities in life, such as taking care of her children and her household, and D, had always been convinced that she was hopelessly stupid. When this patient was shown that her entire philosophy of life, or basic set of assumptions concerning her thinking, her self-worthless, when she was induced to and persuaded to question and challenge and tackle that silly and irrational set of assumptions, she started for the first time in her life to enjoy herself in many ways, including sexual participation. She had to be trained, as most of my impotent and frigid patients do, to focus adequately on sexually arousing stimuli when having sex relations. But it was not difficult to get her to do this kind of focusing once she accepted the basic assumption that she was worthwhile and that she did have a right as a human being to enjoy herself. Let me say in conclusion that although I see many people every year who specifically come to me for psychosexual problems, I rarely see one who has what I would call a real sex problem. Invariably, my patients have general disturbances which stem from their poor, illogical, and self-defeating general philosophies of life. Their sex symptoms almost always are derivatives of these idiotic general philosophies. And when their basic philosophies, philosophic assumptions of which they are unconscious in the sense of not knowing how important they are to their lives, are forthrightly brought to their attention, ruthlessly pilloried and analyzed to show how ridiculous they are, and consistently attacked, discouraged, rooted up, their sex problems do not automatically vanish, but are at least susceptible to specific, re-educating instruction. To the usual psychotherapeutic techniques of exploration, ventilation, excavation, and interpretation, the rational therapist adds the more direct techniques of confrontation, confutation, de-indoctrination, and re-education. He thereby frankly faces and resolutely tackles the deepest seated and most recalcitrant patterns of sexual and general disturbance. In this excerpt from my book, The Art and Science of Love, you see some of the aspects of tackling the problem of guilt and shame, because it's not enough to analyze, to show people in groups or individually that they have a certain set of assumptions or philosophic biases. One must forthright, steadily, completely attack, just as the patient is unfortunately over and over telling himself the same nonsense that he has told himself for many years after picking it up originally from his parents, his cultures, his reading matter, and so on. Well, I'm sure that a lot of you would have at me at this point, so I will stop here and give anybody who has questions, challenges, discussions, an ample opportunity to say what he or she has to say. Thank you.